confront ourselves with the question, what are our values? My father presented Dr. King at one point with an award. It was the World Peace Award given by the Synagogue Council of America. And in presenting the award, he said, "The glory of God is concealed, yet there are moments in which it is revealed." What is the nature of the glory? And by the way, the word in Hebrew is kavod, kavod Hashem, the glory of God. Moses, in his great petition, called upon God, "Show me, I pray thee, thy glory," and his petition was granted. The glory of God is concealed, yet there are moments in which it is revealed. We sense a glimpse of the glory in the life of Martin Luther King, and we honor him because his words and his deeds are a marvelous glorification of God who is merciful and gracious. Sacred and magnificent is the work he does for all of us in America. At the same time, the scope of God's glory is the whole world, all of humanity. My father was a very passionate person, tremendously empathic and kind and gentle person, a very loving father. And he was passionate about injustice. He was sleepless about Vietnam. He talked to me from the time I was a child, little girl, about racism. He spoke with old people. There's Albert Clegg, who at the time was considered so radical, pastor in Detroit. My father had channels open to everyone and listened. In 1965 was an amazing year. March of 1965 was the March at Selma. The summer of '65, my father spent 2 months in Israel lecturing all around the country. He came back and he founded an organization called Clergy and Laymen Concerned About Vietnam. And later in October, Nostra Aetate, the Second Vatican Council's declaration on a new relationship between the Catholic Church and the Jewish people, a relationship that no more would blame old Jews for the death of Jesus and would henceforth not try to missionize Jews. And then in November, my father delivered a wonderful lecture called "No Religion is an Island." No religion is an island. What does that mean? It means that we are affected by each other. That when Christians are pious, Jews will also be pious, and vice versa. And when one does something bad, the other is also hurt. No religion is an island means that you can't be oblivious to society and to political issues. I can't pray, my father says, when there is social injustice. My father went to a demonstration against the war in Vietnam, and a very unfriendly journalist came over to him and said, "What are you doing here?" My father said, "I'm here because I can't pray." And the journalist said, "What are you talking about? You can't pray, so you go to a demonstration?" And my father said, "When I open the prayer book, I see before me children burning from napalm. How can I pray?" Because we learned by this time that there were war crimes being committed in Vietnam. And it was under the auspices of Clergy and Laymen Concerned About Vietnam that Dr. King came to Riverside Church to speak out against the war. My father came back from Selma and he said, "I am here because I'm involved in the fate and dignity of my fellow man." And it was a very difficult time, and I remember it vividly as a child. Should Dr. King speak out against the war? What would it do to the relationship he had with the president and with Congress? Would it undermine the civil rights movement? It was April 4th, 1967. Dr. King came to Riverside Church and he spoke out against the war. The next day he was attacked by everyone, by the way, by the New York Times, by other civil rights leaders. Dr. King said, "A true revolution of values will lay hand on the world order and say of war, this way of settling differences is not just. A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death." America, the richest and most powerful nation in the world, can well lead the way in this revolution of values. A genuine revolution of values means, in the final analysis, that our loyalties must become ecumenical rather than sectional. Every nation must now develop an overriding loyalty to mankind as a whole in order to preserve the best in their individual societies. I was there that evening, by the way, in Riverside Church, and my father, and it was packed. Originally, Dr. King was supposed to speak in the small chapel of Union Theological Seminary, which might have held perhaps 200 people. And then at the last minute, they moved into this huge, magnificent Riverside Church that holds over 1,000 people, and they had to turn away hundreds. And my father introduced Dr. King that night, and he said, I'll just read the bottom, "It is our duty as citizens to say no to the subversiveness of our government, which is ruining the values we cherish." I want to just say something about what it means for Jews, the civil rights movement. Think about the timing. What happened to Jews after World War II? For one thing, Zionism was no longer a matter of choice. The whole world recognized the Jewish need for political independence, safety, a homeland, a state, and voted in the UN to bring Israel into being. But it wasn't just a matter of security for our bodies. Jewish souls had also been murdered. How do we regain our souls? This was a crisis of Jewish spirit. Can we restore, recreate? The crisis wasn't just about restitution, certainly not about forgiveness of Nazis. It was about rebuilding a vision for us as Jews, but for all of humanity. Never again to Jews or never again to anyone. In many ways, the civil rights movement gave us back our souls. It gave us back our passion for the Bible. It reoriented us. It made us as Jews focus on what was important in Jewish tradition. We regained our love of the Bible and the prophets. My father said he's involved with every human being. When he came back from Selma, he wrote in his diary that Dr. King said to him it was the greatest day of his life. My father said it felt holy to him, reminded him of walking with Hasidic Rebbes in Europe. He said, "I felt my legs were praying." And I think when he said that, he meant it in a very serious and profound way. It meant a great deal to him. In 1968, on March 25th, just 10 days before he was assassinated, Dr. King came to deliver the keynote address at a conference honoring my father. Let me just point, though, before I come to that, to one other event that took place. The organization, Clergy and Laymen Concerned About Vietnam, wanted to have a demonstration against the war at Arlington National Cemetery. This was in February of '68. But the government said no, they couldn't have a demonstration, so they asked for permission to pray. And they were allowed to pray, but they said only 1 minute. 2,500 people came, including a plane load of 65 clergy from Seattle. And they gathered and they prayed. One of the people present is a Reform Rabbi, Maurice Eisendroth, brought a Torah scroll. And here's Dr. King arriving just a few weeks later, March 25th, at the Concord Hotel, to deliver the keynote address. It was a celebration honoring my father, convened by the Rabbinical Assembly of America. It's an umbrella organization of conservative rabbis. That night, after dinner, we all went into the auditorium, and when Dr. King came into the room, and there were about 1,000 people, rabbis and their wives, they were all men rabbis in those days, and we linked arms and we sang, "We Shall Overcome" in Hebrew. And Dr. King was so pleased, and he said he had heard "We Shall Overcome" all over the world, but this was the first time in Hebrew. And my father introduced Dr. King that evening, and he said, "Where in America today do we hear a voice like the voice of the prophets of Israel? Martin Luther King is a sign that God has not forsaken the United States of America. God has sent him to us. His presence is the hope of America. His mission is sacred, his leadership of supreme importance to every one of us." That was the year 68 that my father invited Dr. King and his wife and their 4 children to our family Seder. We weren't sure if they would come because Dr. King's schedule was uncertain always, but we looked forward to it. And then that Seder would have taken place on April 16th, but you know, on April 4th, Dr. King was murdered. My father flew to Memphis, he's over there on the far right, and participated in that march. And then my mother and I joined him at the funeral in Atlanta. Dr. King gave a wonderful speech in September of 1965 in which he echoed my father's words. He said, "When Moses walked in the courts of Pharaoh and thundered forth with a call to 'let my people go,' he introduced into history the concept of a God who was concerned about the freedom and dignity of all his children. Throughout the history of Israel, we see God active in the affairs of men, struggling relentlessly against the forces of evil that beset them, and seeking to mold a people who will serve as his children, as partners in the building of his kingdom here on earth." I think my father meant it quite seriously and sincerely when he said he felt his legs were praying. It wasn't just a metaphor. It did feel holy to him in Selma. He had the feeling that he could transform people, and that Dr. King had lifted us as Americans out of our bigotry. Such things had a messianic quality. What was the motivation? Yes, there was a moral emergency in my father's own life in Germany. But I would say that he lived in a state of moral emergency, and I think Dr. King did as well, because that's what it means to be a religious person. What does religion have to contribute to our ongoing work to overcome racism? Yes, as Dr. King says here, God is still active, but we are not always God's partners. When we think of Ferguson, Cleveland, Charleston, Prairie View, New York, Baltimore, we realize we're still in Egypt. We haven't yet crossed the Red Sea. We haven't yet made our way from Selma to Montgomery. Our United States, like all governments, is supposed to express in its laws the will of the people. In the days of the prophets, the king was reprimanded. Injustice prevailed and the prophet warned of dire consequences. In our day, no one advocates police killings, but the danger comes at moments when representatives of the state act as if the laws don't apply to them, as if they can act as they will, as judge, jury, and executioner. The government can also declare a state of emergency, and suspend constitutional rights and laws, unleashing a monstrosity of cruelty on those who stand in the position of bearing the brunt of that cruelty. So finally, what is moral emergency? Moral emergency is an invocation of the prophetic tradition, an interruption of the government, an insistence on justice in the name of the transcendent God whose presence becomes imminent in his witnesses on earth. Because, my father said, ultimately, the teaching of the prophets is that in a free society, some are guilty, but all are responsible. Thank you. And I'm happy for your questions or comments. Yes?
So I'll ask you a fairly easy one. Can you talk to us about what interactions you might have had as a young girl with Dr. King when you were with your father and he was with him? What was the nature of that interaction? Was he substantial with you? Was he cordial? Was it, how old were you? And give us some human sense of your relationship with him.
So I was young. So there was no substantive discussion of philosophical ideas with me. But I met Dr. King on several occasions. I also have to say that the reason the reason I'm a religion professor today is Dr. King, because I was sent to an Orthodox day school when I was a child where we had to memorize the Bible. Memorize the Hebrew and memorize the Aramaic translation, and we had little tests that would say, who said this to whom? Is it Moses to God or God to Moses? Really very awful kind of rote learning that I hated and I thought was meaningless and didn't talk about the substance of what it means. And so I was very alienated, and Dr. King changed me totally, because when he spoke, the prophets came alive. Sometimes I would listen, I would think, what is a verse from the prophets and what are his words? And the way they came together was so beautiful and inspiring, the way the Bible came alive, and the way the Bible changed people, and the way he invoked the Bible to soften hardened hearts. That was extraordinary to me. And yes, I will tell you, not everybody you saw in that film earlier was actually a friend of my father's or really knew anything, but they like to talk sometimes. Dr. King loved my father. And you know how I know that? I know that because of how kind he was to me. And I know it because Mrs. King was so kind to me, to my mother, to my daughter when she met her. That Yolanda King, Mrs. King wanted me to become friends with Yolanda, and we did, and we used to give lectures together. That was a very special relationship. It was very, very dear, very close. I can tell you, Dr. King gave me an important gift and lesson once. It was actually in that speech in March of 1968. It was a long evening. I'm sure he was very tired after giving the lecture, and he probably just wanted to relax. And he and my father wanted to go off and talk somewhere, and my father brought me up to him and said, "Do you remember Susie?" Now, why should he remember me? I was a nobody. I was just a child. And he could have just said, "Hello, hello," but he didn't. He said with enthusiasm, "Of course I remember Susie." And I thought that was such a gift, that he, at the end of a long, tired evening, that he would say that to me. That was such a gift of his warmth and attention and affection. And then he turned to one of his assistants and asked him if he would basically babysit me while he and my father had their meeting, which I also thought was incredibly generous and sweet. And so I remember that in moments when I'm tired and I have a long line of students outside my office and I'm a little grumpy. And I don't allow myself to be grumpy because he didn't. So I feel I transmit Dr. King's gift to my students. Anybody else? Yes?
I just want to thank you. You have just made my evening so perfect.
Oh.
I mean, really. And Jonathan, I mean, he is a lot like you. From what little I know, I've encountered Jonathan in that kind of a situation when nobody was willing to be there, especially not Jewish people. He would show up. I remember several times. So he wasn't Martin Luther King or your daddy, but I'm glad he brought you here. And I'm a survivor of the Holocaust. And I have, for myself, accepted that my parents were killed. And I have even gone as far as forgiving for myself. And out of that, God came into my life. Because everyone always said, we're all God's children. I wasn't anybody's children. I couldn't find proof that I was anyone's children. And when I had that sense of accepting, forgiving, and God asks us to forgive, and we're asked to forgive, you know, and He forgives us, and it made all the difference. So you are so deep and so beautiful. Thank you so much.
To me, the important thing that you said, to me, the important thing that you said is how far have we really come when so many Black people are incarcerated? You know, I mean, there's just so much work that has to be done.
The question is, how far have we come, actually, when there's still so much work to be done? And you know, yeah. So what's going on in this world? What is going on in this society? Why is this continuing this way? Why did the Voting Rights Act come to be eviscerated by individual states? You know, so we have a problem. We have a white problem in this country. We have a problem of cruelty and indifference and bigotry. I also want to just say that you know, when we talk about race, one of the problems is that we focus on the problems. So we focus on things like Michelle Alexander. How many people have read her book, Michelle Alexander, The New Jim Crow? It's a really important book to read. Okay, more people should read it. How many people have read Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, Between the World and Me? You're kidding me.
We're not proud of it.
Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, Between the World and Me, you must read this book. Oh my goodness. Houston. You know he's up for a National Book Award tonight. And you might even read Michelle Alexander's review of the book in the New York Times, where she compares it to James Baldwin's book, his letter to his nephew. How many of you have read that? Okay. And she says the difference is that Baldwin has hope for the future and Coates, it leaves us in a sense of pessimism and despair. But you have to read it. It's a very important book. It's really the book to read right now. Coates, C-O-A-T-E-S. Okay. But the problem is this. When we talk about racism, what do we talk about? We talk about all the negative. We talk about imprisonment. We talk about the difference in African American lifespan and white lifespan in this country. We talk about income disparity. 11 times, white people earn 11 times as much as black people. What does that mean? $110,000 to $10,000? These are outrageous, outrageous numbers. On the other hand, we have to also be cautious, and I say this to myself as a critique of what I presented tonight, which is if we only talk about the negative, we're painting a very negative portrayal of what African American life is like in this country. Not everybody is, yeah? And that bothers me as well. So how do we talk about racism without presenting some picture as if all black people are in prison? Do you understand what I'm saying? And that's the difficulty. That's a problem. We want to address it, and yet we don't want to leave it with that. You understand what I'm talking about? I'm sort of talking in shorthand here, but you know what I mean. Yeah. Yes?
Great. In the 60s in the South, watching the civil rights movement and experiencing segregation as well in the South, but watching it on television, you kind of develop as a kid, kind of a kid's eye view of what's going on. I remember the Selma, I think I remember the Sunday Bloody Sunday. I don't know if I've seen some of the newsreel, versions of it or not, but I think I remember it as a kid, my parents being outraged about it. When I saw it on television, you actually, had that experience. You wrote a wonderful essay about when your father went to Selma. And I thought if you could maybe just talk a little bit about that, because what did you understand was going on there?
What did I understand was going on in those days? We certainly, we actually had a little black and white television that was turned on for the news every evening. Walter Cronkite, remember him? And yes, we saw what was going on in the South, and it was horrific to watch the cruelty everywhere in Birmingham, in Montgomery. I went twice actually on that trip to Birmingham, Montgomery, and Selma that Representative John Lewis led. And one of the things that he said was, Alabama was terrible, but Mississippi was a different order altogether. And he said that when you drove from Alabama into Mississippi, there was a billboard that said, "Welcome to Mississippi, prepare to meet your maker." Yeah? Which of course sounded like a terrible threat, and was a threat. So in those days, yes, my father talked about it all the time. We talked about it as a moral issue, not a political issue. It wasn't about calculating politics. And I have to say that this was true also of the way my father talked about Jewish issues. We didn't sit around the table, I don't know how to say this to translate this, but he wasn't a Shulchan Aruch Jew who worried about, well, is it permissible to gather the crumbs on the tablecloth on the Sabbath? It was more about the spirit. How do you create? For example, it says in the Bible that you shouldn't light a fire on the Sabbath. And a fire means in your oven, in your stove, whatever. Fine, and we didn't, of course. But my father said it also means you shouldn't light the fire of controversy. So certain things we didn't talk about on the Sabbath. We didn't talk about things that were horrific, and we didn't talk about politics in an ugly way, yeah? But everything became a moral issue. So the civil rights movement was a moral issue. And so was the war in Vietnam. It was a moral issue. It was a moral issue about whether it was morally acceptable to encourage Dr. King to speak out against the war in Vietnam. It was a moral dilemma, everything. When we received the telegram, my father was at his office and it came to our home asking him to join the march in Selma. It was a Friday afternoon, and of course it was busy. My father had to make a plane reservation for Saturday night because he didn't travel on the Sabbath, and we had to pack a little suitcase, and it was a nervous Sabbath. And when the Sabbath was over and my father said the prayer, Havdalah, and then we left. We lived on the 8th floor, and I remember riding down the elevator, and we went outside, and a taxi came, and I remember my father kissing me goodbye because I was afraid it was the last time I would ever see him. And I remember watching him get into the taxi and go to the airport and go to Selma, and of course we were frightened. And when he came back, he brought the lei that a Hawaiian representative had brought to Selma. And he talked about what it was like. He said, one of the things that he wrote in his diary, that it was worship. Legs don't sing, he said, and yet it felt that we were uttering prayers. He felt it was holy. How do you discover a holy dimension in your life? I think that when religious writers like my